The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, on October 16, 1993, as if nature itself was trying to shroud the events that would unfold. Sarah Michelle Hartwell stood before the antique mirror in her childhood bedroom, her trembling fingers adjusting the delicate pearl buttons on her grandmother's ivory wedding dress. The silk fabric, yellowed slightly with age, still held the faint scent of lavender from decades past. Outside her window, the maple trees blazed with autumn colors, their leaves dancing in the crisp morning breeze. "You look absolutely radiant, sweetheart," whispered her mother, Margaret Hartwell, as she carefully placed the family heirloom veil over Sarah's auburn hair. The handmade Belgian lace had been passed down through 4 generations of Hartwell women, each bride adding their own story to its delicate threads. Margaret's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she stepped back to admire her daughter. "Your great-great-grandmother would be so proud." Before we continue with Sarah's story, I'd love for you to take a moment to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. It really helps us bring you more mysterious stories like this one. And please, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. Now let's return to that fateful October morning in 1993. Sarah's wedding to David Patterson was set for 2 p.m. at the historic Whispering Pines Chapel, a small stone church nestled among the Pennsylvania countryside that had witnessed countless unions over its 150-year history. David, a local high school history teacher with kind blue eyes and an infectious laugh, had proposed to Sarah the previous Christmas Eve under the town's decorated gazebo. Their love story had been the talk of Cedar Falls, a tight-knit community of just over 3,000 residents where everyone knew everyone else's business. The phone rang downstairs, its shrill tone cutting through the morning quiet. Margaret hurried to answer it, leaving Sarah alone with her reflection. The young woman, just 24 years old, worked as a librarian at the Cedar Falls Public Library, a job she'd held since graduating from Penn State with a degree in English literature. She loved the quiet sanctuary of books, the way stories could transport people to different worlds and times. Today, she was about to begin the greatest chapter of her own story. "Sarah, honey, that was Mrs. Patterson," Margaret called from downstairs. "She wanted to make sure you remembered that David's aunt is bringing the flowers from Philadelphia. The order got delayed, but they'll be there in time for the ceremony." Sarah nodded to herself in the mirror, though her mother couldn't see her. Everything had been planned to perfection. The reception would be held at the Cedar Falls Community Center, decorated with white roses and baby's breath. Her maid of honor, Jessica Morgan, her best friend since 3rd grade, had spent weeks perfecting the seating arrangements and ensuring every detail was just right. Even the weather had cooperated. The forecast called for partly cloudy skies with temperatures in the comfortable mid-60s. At 11:30 a.m., Sarah descended the narrow staircase of her family's colonial-style home on Elm Street. The house, built in 1887, had been in the Hartwell family for 3 generations. Her father, Robert Hartwell, waited at the bottom of the stairs in his pressed navy suit, his usually stoic demeanor softened by obvious emotion. Robert worked as a foreman at the local paper mill and had raised Sarah to be independent and strong-willed, values that sometimes put her at odds with the more traditional expectations of their small town. "You ready for this, kiddo?" Robert asked, using the nickname he'd called her since childhood. "More ready than I've ever been for anything," Sarah replied, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. The plan was simple. Sarah would spend the late morning getting her hair touched up at Donna's beauty salon on Main Street, then return home for final preparations before heading to the church. Margaret had arranged for professional photographs to be taken at the house before the ceremony, wanting to capture every precious moment of her only daughter's wedding day. At exactly noon, Sarah kissed her parents goodbye and stepped into her white Honda Civic, the same car she'd driven since college. The autumn air was crisp and invigorating as she rolled down the windows, letting the cool breeze play with the loose tendrils of hair that had escaped her careful styling. Main Street stretched before her like a scene from a Norman Rockwell painting. The old-fashioned street lamps, the brick storefronts with their hand-painted signs, the elderly men playing checkers outside Miller's hardware store. Donna's beauty salon occupied a narrow building squeezed between the post office and Thompson's drugstore. Sarah had been getting her hair cut here since she was 5 years old, and Donna Mitchell had become almost like a second mother to her. The salon's interior hadn't changed much over the years. The same pink and mint green color scheme, the same collection of outdated magazines, the same gentle hum of hairdryers and quiet conversation. "There's my beautiful bride," Donna exclaimed as Sarah pushed through the glass door, the little bell above it announcing her arrival. "Come on back, honey. I've got everything ready for you." Sarah settled into the familiar vinyl chair, closing her eyes as Donna began working her magic with hot rollers and hairspray. The other women in the salon, Mrs. Kowalski getting her weekly perm, teenage twins Amy and Anna Brennan preparing for homecoming, all offered their congratulations and best wishes. For a moment, Sarah felt wrapped in the warm embrace of community that made Cedar Falls feel like the safest place on earth. "You nervous?" Donna asked as she carefully arranged Sarah's curls. "A little," Sarah admitted. "But good nervous, you know. Like standing at the edge of a diving board, knowing the water's going to be perfect." By 12:45 p.m., Donna had worked her usual magic. Sarah's hair was swept up in an elegant chignon with soft curls framing her face, exactly the style they had practiced weeks earlier. She paid her bill, left a generous tip, and promised to bring Donna wedding cake the following week. The drive home should have taken exactly 7 minutes. Sarah had made this journey thousands of times, down Main Street, left on Maple Avenue, right on Elm Street, 3 blocks to her parents' house. The route was so familiar, she could drive it blindfolded. Several neighbors later reported seeing her white Honda making the left turn onto Maple Avenue at approximately 12:52 p.m. Mrs. Eleanor Fitzpatrick, who was tending her prize-winning rose garden, waved from her front yard and later told police that Sarah had smiled and waved back, appearing completely normal and happy. That was the last confirmed sighting of Sarah Michelle Hartwell. At 1:15 p.m., Margaret Hartwell began to worry. The photographer had arrived on schedule and was setting up his equipment in the living room, arranging lights and checking camera angles. By 1:25 p.m., Margaret was calling the beauty salon, but Donna confirmed that Sarah had left right on schedule. By 1:35 p.m., both parents were standing on their front porch, scanning the street for any sign of their daughter's white Honda. David Patterson arrived at the Hartwell house at 1:40 p.m., breaking with tradition because he was concerned about Sarah's absence. His usually calm demeanor was replaced by obvious anxiety as he paced the living room, running his hands through his dark hair. The photographer, sensing the tension, quietly began packing his equipment. "Maybe she had car trouble," David suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. "You know how that old Honda has been acting up." Robert Hartwell was already reaching for his car keys. "I'm going to drive the route between here and Donna's. Maybe she pulled over somewhere." But even as he spoke, a cold dread was settling in his stomach. Sarah was the most punctual person he knew, a trait she'd inherited from him. She would never be late for her own wedding without calling. The search began informally at first. Robert drove every street between the salon and his house, checking alleys and parking lots. Margaret called the church, hoping against hope that Sarah had gone there directly for some reason. David contacted his groomsmen, asking them to help look. By 2:30 p.m., the time the ceremony should have been starting, word had spread throughout Cedar Falls that something was wrong. Chief of Police William "Bill" Morrison, a 20-year veteran who had known Sarah since she was a little girl riding her bicycle past the police station, officially classified her as a missing person at 3:17 p.m. The 51-year-old chief, known for his methodical approach and unflappable demeanor, immediately organized a systematic search of the area. Within an hour, volunteer search teams were combing through the wooded areas surrounding town, calling Sarah's name until their voices grew hoarse. The white Honda Civic was discovered at 4:43 p.m. by a group of teenage boys who were supposed to be at the wedding reception, but had instead joined the search effort. The car was parked behind Fletcher's abandoned mill, a crumbling brick structure that had once been the heart of Cedar Falls' economy, but had stood empty for over a decade. The mill sat on the banks of Cedar Creek, about 2 miles from the downtown area, and completely off the route Sarah would have taken home from the salon. Police Sergeant Janet Walsh, a 15-year veteran and one of only 2 female officers in the department, was the first official responder to reach the Honda. She found the car unlocked, the keys still in the ignition, and Sarah's purse sitting on the passenger seat with $247 in cash, her credit cards and driver's license all untouched. There were no signs of a struggle inside the vehicle, no broken glass, no blood, nothing to indicate violence had occurred. Most haunting of all was what wasn't there. Sarah herself had vanished without a trace, as if she had simply stepped out of the car and disappeared into thin air. Her wedding shoes, delicate ivory pumps with pearl buttons that matched her dress, were found neatly placed on the driver's seat, as if she had carefully removed them before walking away. But where could she have gone in her stocking feet, wearing a full wedding dress, without anyone seeing her? The mill and its surroundings were immediately secured as a crime scene. Chief Morrison called in the Pennsylvania State Police to assist with the investigation, and by evening, officers with specialized training in missing persons cases had arrived from Harrisburg. The area around Cedar Creek was searched with boats and divers, while trained dogs followed scent trails that seemed to lead nowhere, as if Sarah had simply vanished into the autumn air. The wedding guests who had gathered at Whispering Pines Chapel in their finest clothes and most festive moods, instead found themselves questioning each other about when they had last seen Sarah and whether they had noticed anything unusual in recent weeks. The flowers that had finally arrived from Philadelphia wilted in their arrangements as the hours passed, a beautiful backdrop to an increasingly desperate situation. As night fell on October 16, 1993, the small town of Cedar Falls found itself gripped by a mystery that would haunt its residents for decades to come. Porch lights stayed on later than usual, parents called their children inside earlier, and neighbors looked at each other with new wariness. In a community where everyone knew everyone, the impossible had happened. One of their own had simply vanished without explanation, leaving behind only questions and a pair of wedding shoes that would become the most heartbreaking evidence in a case that seemed to have no answers. The investigation into Sarah Hartwell's disappearance began in earnest on October 17, 1993, as a grey dawn broke over Cedar Falls. Chief Morrison had barely slept, spending most of the night coordinating with state authorities and reviewing the few facts they had established. The Pennsylvania State Police had sent Detective Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez, a 12-year veteran specializing in missing persons cases, to lead the investigation. Rodriguez, a methodical man in his early 40s with graying temples and intense brown eyes, had worked dozens of similar cases throughout the state. But something about Sarah's disappearance felt different from the moment he arrived in the small town. The first priority was establishing a timeline of Sarah's movements on the day she vanished. Rodriguez and Chief Morrison worked together to interview everyone who had seen Sarah that morning, starting with her parents and moving through the beauty salon staff and customers. Each interview painted the same picture: a happy, excited bride-to-be who showed no signs of distress or unusual behavior. Donna Mitchell proved to be a particularly valuable witness. "I've been doing hair for 23 years, she told the investigators, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by obvious distress. "You learn to read people, you know. Women tell their hairdressers everything." Sarah was glowing, absolutely glowing. She talked about her honeymoon plans, about wanting to start a family in a few years. She even mentioned how she wanted to redecorate David's apartment after they moved in together. That's not a woman planning to run away. The physical evidence at the mill site was processed by state crime lab technicians, but it yielded frustratingly little information. Tire tracks in the soft earth near the creek were too degraded to provide useful impressions. The mill building itself, with its broken windows and graffiti-covered walls, showed no signs of recent disturbance. Most puzzling of all, the scent trail that police dogs had followed from Sarah's car ended abruptly, about 50 yards from the vehicle, near the creek's edge. "It's like she just evaporated," Officer Janet Walsh observed, as she stood on the muddy bank where the trail disappeared. The creek at this point was shallow, no more than 3 feet deep, and moved slowly over a bed of smooth stones. If Sarah had entered the water, there should have been some trace of fabric or other evidence, but extensive searching revealed nothing. David Patterson submitted to questioning without hesitation, understanding that as the fiancé, he would naturally be considered a person of interest. The 26-year-old teacher spent nearly 4 hours with Detective Rodriguez, going over every detail of his relationship with Sarah, their wedding plans, and his whereabouts on the morning of October 16th. David's alibi was solid. He had spent the morning at his apartment grading papers and preparing for the ceremony, with phone calls from his best man and several family members to confirm his presence there. "Sarah and I had talked about everything," David told Rodriguez, his voice breaking with emotion. "Our future, our dreams, even the silly little details, like what we'd name our kids someday. She wanted to travel before we settled down. We were planning to visit Ireland next spring for our first anniversary. She had books about Irish history checked out from the library. Why would she disappear 3 hours before our wedding? It makes no sense." The investigation expanded to include Sarah's co-workers at the Cedar Falls Public Library. Head librarian Martha Whitman, a 58-year-old woman who had supervised Sarah for 3 years, described her as reliable, punctual, and well-liked by both staff and patrons. "Sarah loved her job," Whitman explained. "She was working on a project to digitize our local history collection. Just last week, she was excited about some old photographs she'd found of the town from the 1920s. She had so many plans for improving our children's reading program, too. This isn't someone who would just walk away from her life." Sarah's best friend and maid of honor, Jessica Morgan, provided perhaps the most intimate portrait of the missing woman's state of mind in the days leading up to the wedding. Jessica, a nurse at the county hospital, had spoken with Sarah by phone on the evening of October 15th, just hours before the disappearance. "She was nervous about the usual things," Jessica told investigators. "Whether the flowers would be perfect, whether David's great-aunt would behave herself at the reception, whether her dress still fit right. Normal bride stuff. But she was happy, really happy. She kept saying she felt like the luckiest woman in the world. We even joked about how she'd probably cry during her vows and ruin her makeup." As word of Sarah's disappearance spread beyond Cedar Falls, media attention began to focus on the small town. Local newspapers picked up the story first, followed by television stations from nearby cities. By the end of the second week, Sarah's case had been featured on several regional news programs, and the Hartwell family had received dozens of calls from people claiming to have seen her in various locations across Pennsylvania and neighboring states. Margaret Hartwell threw herself into coordinating the search efforts, turning the family's living room into a makeshift command center. Phone trees were organized to notify volunteers about search activities. Missing person flyers featuring Sarah's engagement photo were distributed to every business in a 50-mile radius. The image showed Sarah's bright smile and sparkling green eyes, her auburn hair catching the sunlight, looking every inch the happy bride-to-be she had been just weeks before the photo was taken. Robert Hartwell took a leave of absence from the paper mill and spent his days driving through neighboring counties, following up on reported sightings and checking with local police departments. His methodical nature served him well in this grim task, as he carefully documented every lead and maintained detailed maps marking areas that had been searched. The physical activity helped him cope with the helpless feeling that threatened to overwhelm him whenever he stopped moving long enough to think about what might have happened to his daughter. The investigation took its first significant turn 3 weeks after Sarah's disappearance, when Detective Rodriguez received a call from the FBI's National Crime Information Center. A similar case had occurred in 1989 in a small town in Ohio. A young woman named Rebecca Torres had vanished on the morning of her wedding, leaving her car in an isolated location with her shoes placed on the driver's seat. Rebecca had never been found, and no arrests had ever been made in connection with her disappearance. Rodriguez immediately traveled to Ohio to meet with the investigators who had worked the Torres case. Detective Sergeant Emily Foster of the Ohio State Police had never forgotten the case that had consumed 2 years of her career and ultimately remained unsolved. As Rodriguez shared the details of Sarah's disappearance, Foster felt a chill of recognition. "The similarities are too specific to be coincidental," Foster explained, as they reviewed both case files in her Columbus office. "The wedding day timing, the abandoned vehicle, the shoes placed on the seat, these aren't details that would occur naturally to someone trying to stage a disappearance. This suggests we might be dealing with a serial offender, someone who specifically targets brides." The possibility that Sarah had been the victim of a predator who targeted women on their wedding days opened up new avenues of investigation, but it also brought new challenges. If the perpetrator was mobile and operating across state lines, the case became exponentially more complex. Rodriguez expanded his search to include missing persons databases from multiple states, looking for other cases with similar circumstances. Meanwhile, the residents of Cedar Falls struggled to process the idea that their safe, close-knit community might have been invaded by someone capable of such calculated evil. Property values began to decline as families considered moving away from a place that no longer felt secure. The local economy, dependent largely on tourism related to the area's covered bridges and fall foliage, suffered as visitors chose other destinations for their autumn getaways. Pastor William Hendricks of Whispering Pines Chapel, where Sarah and David were to have been married, found himself counseling not only the immediate families, but much of the congregation as they grappled with questions about faith and justice in the face of such inexplicable tragedy. "Evil exists in the world," he told his parishioners during a Sunday service 6 weeks after Sarah's disappearance. "But so does hope, and so does love. We must not let fear drive out the very qualities that make us human." The Christmas season of 1993 arrived in Cedar Falls like an unwelcome guest. Decorations went up later than usual and came down earlier. The annual Christmas Eve service at Whispering Pines Chapel drew the largest crowd in years as residents sought comfort in community and faith. David Patterson attended with Sarah's parents, the 4 of them sitting in the pew where Sarah should have been, her absence a palpable presence among them. As winter deepened and the investigation continued without breakthrough, Detective Rodriguez found himself returning again and again to the evidence from the mill site. Something about the scene bothered him, though he couldn't articulate exactly what it was. The careful placement of the wedding shoes suggested staging, but the lack of any other physical evidence was puzzling. Most crime scenes, even carefully planned ones, yielded some trace of the perpetrator's presence. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source in February 1994, when a maintenance worker at Fletcher's Mill discovered something the initial search had missed. While checking the building's structural integrity for a potential buyer, worker Tom Brennan found a small piece of ivory silk fabric caught on a nail inside one of the mill's ground floor windows. The fabric, when tested by the state crime lab, was confirmed to be a match for Sarah's wedding dress. This discovery confirmed that Sarah had been inside the mill building, but it raised new questions about how she had gotten there and what had happened next. The mill was searched again, this time with cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar, but no additional evidence was found. The single piece of fabric remained the only concrete proof that Sarah had been at the mill, a tantalizing clue that nonetheless failed to provide answers about her ultimate fate. The years that followed brought periodic developments in the case, but none that led to resolution. In 1996, another bride vanished under similar circumstances in West Virginia, strengthening the theory that a serial predator was responsible. In 1999, a woman in Michigan reported being approached by a man who claimed to be a wedding photographer and asked detailed questions about her upcoming ceremony, but she became suspicious and contacted police. The man was never identified or located. David Patterson eventually left Cedar Falls, unable to bear the constant reminders of his lost love. He moved to Colorado, where he became a park ranger and never married. "Part of me is still waiting for her to come home," he admitted in a 2003 interview with a true crime magazine. "I know it's not rational, but I can't seem to let go of the hope that someday I'll get an answer, some kind of closure." Margaret and Robert Hartwell remained in the family home on Elm Street, maintaining Sarah's room exactly as she had left it and continuing to coordinate search efforts and follow up on leads. Margaret became an advocate for missing persons' families, eventually helping to establish a support group that met monthly at the Cedar Falls Community Center, the same building where Sarah's wedding reception was to have been held. As the 10th anniversary of Sarah's disappearance approached in 2003, Chief Morrison, now nearing retirement, made a decision that would prove prescient. He authorized the creation of a detailed case file summary that would be distributed to law enforcement agencies across the country, hoping that someone, somewhere, might recognize a pattern or remember a detail that could break the case open. The summary included crime scene photographs, witness statements, and detailed descriptions of Sarah's clothing and personal effects. The case file was uploaded to the FBI's VICAP database and cross-referenced with similar cases dating back to 1980. While this process didn't immediately yield results, it ensured that Sarah's case would remain active in law enforcement databases for years to come, waiting for the right connection to be made. Meanwhile, in a storage facility 3 states away, someone who had been following the investigation very closely was growing increasingly nervous about a particular item in their possession: an ivory wedding veil with handmade Belgian lace that had been passed down through 4 generations of Hartwell women. This person had kept the veil for 31 years, sometimes taking it out to examine the delicate lacework, always planning to dispose of it, but never quite able to follow through. By 2024, advancing age and declining health had begun to weigh heavily on this individual's mind. The weight of carrying such a secret for more than 3 decades had taken its toll, and the fear of dying with the knowledge of what had happened to Sarah Hartwell began to outweigh the fear of exposure. On a cold February morning, this person sat at a kitchen table in a small apartment, carefully wrapping Sarah's wedding veil in tissue paper and placing it in a manila envelope. The decision to return the veil wasn't motivated by guilt or remorse. Those emotions had been suppressed long ago. Instead, it was driven by a practical concern about what would happen to the evidence after death. The veil was the only remaining physical connection to Sarah Hartwell, and its discovery, among personal effects, could potentially lead investigators to other evidence that had been hidden for decades. The anonymous mailing of Sarah's wedding veil to the Cedar Falls Police Department on March 15, 2024, marked the first significant development in the case in over 20 years. The package arrived during Chief Morrison's final week before retirement, a coincidence that felt almost cosmic in its timing. The new chief, Maria Santos, who had been following the Hartwell case since joining the department 5 years earlier, immediately contacted the state police and FBI to report the development. The veil was in remarkable condition, carefully preserved, and showing few signs of deterioration despite its age. Crime lab analysis confirmed that it was indeed Sarah's veil, matching fabric samples that had been stored in evidence for 31 years. More significantly, the veil contained traces of DNA that didn't match Sarah or any of her known family members, potentially providing the first forensic evidence that could identify her abductor. The DNA was run through state and federal databases, but no matches were found among known offenders. However, the genetic material was suitable for genealogical analysis, opening up new possibilities for identification through family connections. The Pennsylvania State Police authorized the use of advanced genealogical techniques that had proven successful in other cold cases, including the Golden State Killer investigation. Meanwhile, the return of the veil had reignited public interest in Sarah's case. Margaret Hartwell, now 78 and in declining health, held the veil with trembling hands as tears streamed down her cheeks. "I never thought I'd see this again," she whispered to the small gathering of family, police, and reporters who had assembled in Chief Santos's office. "It means someone out there knows what happened to my daughter. Someone has answers." Madisium. The genealogical analysis began immediately, with scientists working to build family trees that might lead to the identity of the DNA contributor. This process, which could take weeks or months, represented the best hope for solving Sarah's case that investigators had seen in 3 decades. The person who had mailed the veil, whether motivated by guilt, fear, or some other emotion, had inadvertently provided law enforcement with the tool they needed to potentially close one of Pennsylvania's most enduring mysteries. As news of the veil's return spread through Cedar Falls and beyond, residents found themselves revisiting memories and theories about Sarah's disappearance. The case that had defined their community for over 30 years was suddenly active again, bringing both hope for resolution and anxiety about what truths might finally be revealed. The genealogical analysis of the DNA found on Sarah Hartwell's wedding veil proceeded with painstaking precision throughout the spring and summer of 2024. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a forensic geneticist with the Pennsylvania State Police, worked with a team of specialists to build comprehensive family trees that might lead to the identity of the unknown DNA contributor. The process involved comparing the genetic markers to databases containing millions of profiles from people who had submitted DNA samples for genealogical research, looking for matches that could establish familial relationships. By July 2024, Dr. Vasquez's team had narrowed their search to 3 potential family lines, all with roots in the mid-Atlantic region dating back to the early 1900s. The most promising lead pointed to a family with the surname Macready, whose genealogical tree included several individuals who had lived in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia during the 1980s and 1990s, precisely the geographic area where similar bride disappearances had occurred. The Macready family tree revealed a particularly interesting individual, Thomas Macready, born in 1952, who had worked as a traveling salesman for a photographic equipment company during the 1990s. His sales territory had included all the locations where bride disappearances had been reported, and employment records showed he had been in the Cedar Falls area during the week of October 16, 1993. More significantly, Macready had died in 2019 in a veterans hospital in Virginia, taking any direct answers about Sarah's fate with him to the grave. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Chen, who had taken over the Hartwell case investigation from the retiring Detective Rodriguez, traveled to Virginia to interview McCready's surviving relatives and examine any personal effects that might have been preserved. Chen, a 15-year veteran with a reputation for tenacious investigation of cold cases, found McCready's younger sister, Patricia McCready Williams, living in an assisted care facility in Richmond. Patricia, 69 years old and suffering from early-stage dementia, initially seemed unable to provide useful information about her deceased brother. However, when Chen showed her a photograph of Sarah Hartwell, Patricia's expression changed dramatically. "The pretty girl in the white dress," she whispered, her eyes widening with recognition. "Tommy showed me her picture once. He said she was going to be in his collection." This statement sent chills through the investigation team. Patricia's fragmented memories suggested that Thomas McCready had not only been involved in Sarah's disappearance, but had documented it in some way. When Chen asked about this collection, Patricia became agitated and claimed not to remember anything more. However, she did provide information about her brother's personal effects, which had been stored in a climate-controlled facility in Virginia after his death. The storage unit, rented under McCready's name since 2001, contained what investigators would later describe as a serial killer's trophy room. Carefully organized boxes held photographs, newspaper clippings, and personal items from at least 7 different women who had disappeared on their wedding days between 1989 and 2003. Sarah Hartwell's case file was among the most comprehensive, including photographs that had never been released to the public and detailed notes about her family, her routines, and her wedding plans. Most disturbing was a handwritten journal in which McCready had documented his methodology for selecting and abducting his victims. His entries revealed a calculating predator who specifically targeted brides because, as he wrote, "they represent ultimate happiness, and destroying that creates the deepest despair." The journal included detailed surveillance notes for each victim, showing that McCready had sometimes stalked his targets for weeks or months before acting. The journal entry for October 16, 1993, provided the first clear account of what had happened to Sarah Hartwell. McCready had followed her from the beauty salon to the area near Fletcher's Mill, where he had staged what appeared to be a minor car accident to get her to stop. Once Sarah had gotten out of her car to assist what she believed was an injured motorist, McCready had overpowered her and forced her into his van. According to the journal, Sarah had been taken to an abandoned farmhouse in West Virginia, about 3 hours' drive from Cedar Falls. McCready's notes indicated that he had kept her alive for several days before eventually killing her. The clinical, detached tone of his writing made it clear that he felt no remorse for his actions, viewing his victims as objects rather than human beings. The journal provided directions to the farmhouse where Sarah had been held, though McCready's notes indicated that he had disposed of her remains in a location several miles away from the building. Detective Chen immediately coordinated with West Virginia law enforcement to locate the farmhouse and begin searching for Sarah's remains. The property, which had been abandoned for decades, was now owned by a timber company that granted full access for the investigation. The farmhouse search, conducted in September 2024, revealed additional evidence of McCready's crimes. Forensic archaeologists found human remains at multiple locations on the property, some dating back to the late 1980s. Among the remains were fragments of ivory silk fabric that matched samples from Sarah's wedding dress, finally providing physical confirmation of her fate after 31 years of uncertainty. The discovery of Sarah's remains, while devastating for her family, also brought a measure of closure that had been absent for 3 decades. Margaret Hartwell, now 79 and in fragile health, was able to hold a proper funeral for her daughter on October 16, 2024, exactly 31 years after Sarah's disappearance. The service was held at Whispering Pines Chapel, the same church where Sarah was to have been married, with hundreds of community members in attendance. David Patterson, now 57 and greying at the temples, returned to Cedar Falls for the funeral. He had never stopped loving Sarah, despite the passage of decades, and had never fully moved on with his life. Standing beside Sarah's casket, he placed a single red rose, the flower he had chosen for her bridal bouquet, and whispered words that only he could hear. The investigation revealed that Thomas McCready had been responsible for the deaths of at least 7 women across 4 states, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in the region's history. The bridal killer, as the media dubbed him, had operated for over a decade before apparently retiring from his crimes in 2003. His journal provided no explanation for why he had stopped killing, though investigators theorized that advancing age and health issues may have made it difficult for him to continue his predatory behavior. The person who had anonymously mailed Sarah's veil to the police was never identified, though investigators suspected it may have been someone who had discovered the item among McCready's belongings after his death. The decision to return the veil, regardless of the motivation, had ultimately provided the key to solving not only Sarah's case, but potentially several others that had remained cold for decades. Chief Maria Santos, reflecting on the case's resolution, noted that advances in DNA technology and genealogical analysis had made it possible to solve crimes that would have remained mysteries just a few years earlier. Sarah Hartwell's case shows us that we should never give up hope, Santos said during a press conference announcing the case's closure. Sometimes justice takes 31 years, but it can still arrive. The Hartwell family established a scholarship fund in Sarah's memory at Penn State University, her alma mater, to support students studying library science and English literature. The scholarship ensured that Sarah's love of books and learning would continue to inspire future generations, creating something positive from the tragedy that had defined their lives for so long. Margaret Hartwell lived just long enough to see her daughter's case solved and to attend the funeral she had waited decades to hold. She passed away peacefully in her sleep on December 3, 2024, surrounded by family and holding the wedding veil that had ultimately brought Sarah home. Robert, now 82, continued to live in the family home on Elm Street, tending the garden that Margaret had loved and keeping alive the memories of both women who had meant everything to him. The small town of Cedar Falls slowly began to heal from the wounds that Sarah's disappearance had inflicted on its collective psyche. The sense of safety and security that had been shattered in 1993 couldn't be fully restored, but knowing the truth about what had happened allowed residents to process their grief and begin moving forward. The annual memorial service that had been held every October 16th since Sarah's disappearance became a celebration of her life rather than a mourning of her loss. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Chen, who had worked tirelessly to solve the case, reflected on the investigation's impact on her own life and career. Every cold case represents not just an unsolved crime, but a family trapped in limbo, unable to grieve properly or find peace, Chen explained in an interview after the case's resolution. When we can bring that closure even decades later, it reminds us why this work matters so much. The story of Sarah Michelle Hartwell's disappearance and the 31-year journey to discover the truth serves as both a tragedy and a testament to the persistence of those who refuse to let the missing be forgotten. Her case demonstrated that even when hope seems lost, advances in technology and the dedication of investigators can still bring answers to questions that have haunted communities for decades. In the end, Sarah's wedding veil, the family heirloom that was to have crowned her happiest day, became the key to solving the mystery of her disappearance. The delicate Belgian lace that had been passed down through generations of Hartwell women carried within its fibers the DNA evidence that would finally bring justice for Sarah and closure for those who had never stopped searching for the truth. The empty space that Sarah's absence had created in Cedar Falls could never be completely filled, but knowing what had happened to their missing daughter allowed the community to transform that space from one of anxious uncertainty into one of remembrance and peace. Sarah Michelle Hartwell was finally home, and the questions that had tormented her loved ones for 31 years had finally been answered.